Not too long ago, I talked about the WrestleMania 20 main event and how it ended up way better than what I anticipated. Triple H, Chris Benoit and Shawn Michaels put on a remarkable performance that I wasn't hyped for going into the match, but by the time it was over, I thought it was one of the best Mania main events the WWE ever produced. Well, on the complete flip side, another match took place at WrestleMania 20 that I was actually very excited for, and I'm not ashamed to admit that either. Brock Lesnar versus Bill Goldberg sounded like an explosive battle between two monsters, and I imagined a match where these two would beat the hell out of each other with big power moves, stiff strikes, weapons, the whole 9 yards. I was anticipating King Kong versus Godzilla. I was expecting the ring to get torn apart, a bloodbath, a battle for the ages, and something we would remember for a long time. Well, we do remember the WrestleMania 20 encounter between Brock and Goldberg, but not for the reasons I just mentioned. The triple threat main event quickly changed my expectations in a matter of minutes, and so did the Brock versus Goldberg match. This wasn't King Kong versus Godzilla. It was incredibly painful to watch, if I'm honest. I bought into the hype. I admit they completely got me hook, line and sinker, and it's not like I was a massive fan of Brock or Goldberg around this time period, but it was the potential that this match had that drew me in. That potential was never met. The New York crowd ripped it apart. The guys in the ring didn't seem all that bothered, and the referee of the bout got cheered more than the competitors, which to be fair should have been expected. Today we're going to take a look at Brock Lesnar versus Bill Goldberg at WrestleMania 20. Apologies in advance. We've got a sponsor for today's video. Take a wild guess who it is. Yep, Raid Shadow Legends. You like elves? In the game, the elves were just standard jobber elves, but then a bunch of them turned heel thanks to Dark Lord Sephiroth. Dark Elf versus High Elf warfare has went on for 700 years, and that's some long-term booking right there, my friends. Check out a few legendary Dark Elves like Queen Eva and Ghostborn. This is what happens when you turn to the dark side, and you gotta admit, some of these characters look fantastic. Check out the link in the description or scan the QR code for $30 worth of unique bonuses. Epic Champion Tyrell, 200k silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard. You'll find your treasure right here, and the rewards will be available for the next 30 days, only for new players. Thanks to Raid for sponsoring today's video. Let's get something out of the way before continuing on today. I don't have the same weird hatred for Bill Goldberg nor Brock Lesnar that many other people seem to have. Neither guy was my favourite wrestler back then, but I do appreciate what they brought to the table. Brock Lesnar was, and still is, a freak of nature. He's practically unstoppable. When Brock Lesnar performs, I can't keep my eyes off the TV because guys his size aren't supposed to move that way. The way he can throw people around the ring, the way he looks legitimately scary and intimidating, how he lays it in. I have a lot of fun watching Lesnar compete, and I know some people don't like how he's booked, and I know some people just don't like wrestlers staying at the top for long periods of time, especially heel wrestlers, but I'm just not bothered by Brock Lesnar's WWE runs as much as others. Sorry, but it's the truth. I also admire Brock's honesty about what he wants to get out of the WWE. Lesnar doesn't care much about pro wrestling and the history of pro wrestling. Brock Lesnar wants to make money, and he's said as much countless times, including on official WWE programming such as the Stone Cold podcast. Think about it though, it would be more annoying if Brock lied and said he loved wrestling while holding the belt and sitting at home. Don't get me wrong, I understand why people get annoyed with Lesnar, and I do understand how frustrating it is when a champion isn't around to defend his title, but I just don't mind it as much as others, especially in modern times. Bill Goldberg. Yeah, Goldberg seems to clock in every now and then these days to get the paycheck, or at least that's what it feels like sometimes. But it's a shame that much of the criticism Goldberg receives nowadays is from fans who only know him through his WWE runs. I'm not saying people didn't dislike Goldberg in WCW. There were fans who didn't like the streak, and there were fans smart enough to see WCW were booking themselves in a corner with Goldberg, but you'd be lying to yourself if you said Goldberg wasn't over in WCW during the Monday Night Wars. At one point, he was the most popular act in the whole company. He was one of the very few people who debuted during the NWO era and still managed to break out as a megastar. And that should be proof enough on how popular Goldberg became. Fans back then understood what they were getting with Goldberg. He'd walk out to the stage, he'd breathe smoke, he'd get in the ring, beat the shit out of his opponent, spear, jackhammer, and he's walking back up the ramp with the crowd absolutely losing their minds. This is what people wanted to see. It always got a great reaction, but when Goldberg does that stuff today, it doesn't work out so well because I think it isn't what people want to see anymore, and that's fair enough too. Times change and people expect more, and people also don't want to see the same guys come in and beat other guys who remain in the company for the rest of the year. That's absolutely understandable. When Goldberg first showed up in WWE in 2003, he wasn't put in matches where he would win in a matter of seconds. He had to have longer matches. Some were fine and some were not. I don't think Goldberg ever truly fit in when it came to the WWE, and I think his performances were definitely more suited to and complemented by the breakneck speed of WCW Nitro in the mid to late 90s. Brock Lesnar and Goldberg are respectively unique though, both through their careers and fan perception. Either you like them or you don't. In Madison Square Garden on March 14th, 2004, the fans made sure they let Goldberg and Lesnar know how they truly felt about them, and both men got one of the most hostile reactions in WrestleMania history because both men were getting ready to leave the company. Goldberg had signed a one-year deal with the WWE beginning on March 31st, 2003 and ending at WrestleMania 20. Why he was only signed for a year could be for a few different reasons. Maybe the WWE wanted to see how Goldberg would fit in. Maybe Goldberg didn't want to commit to anything more. Who knows? The stories online are, of course, stories of sensationalism, and it's actually funny how many stories there are and how many reasons we have for Goldberg's departure. Goldberg having problems with Triple H, Linda McMahon calling his run disappointing during a conference call, Goldberg not liking how he was no longer booked as a monster, Goldberg getting mad about a UK show booking, Goldberg not liking the edgier shows the WWE produced at the time, Goldberg not liking the comedy segments he was booked in, Goldberg failing to adjust to backstage politics. It's a never-ending list of unconfirmed reasons. He did, however, mention in interviews that politics backstage were a problem, so we know that much is true. And that could also make Triple H a guilty party, seeing as Bill feuded with Hunter for much of his WWE run. But all we need to know is that Goldberg got paid and he was due to leave after 1 year. There's no sense digging any further. Brock Lesnar debuted on WWE television in 2002, and his amateur credentials mixed with his freakish, imposing look made him an instant star, and he was booked as a monster right from the get-go. Brock went on a WWE crash course in the space of 2 years, flipping from heel to babyface and back to heel, winning the King of the Ring, winning the Undisputed Championship, winning the Royal Rumble, headlining WrestleMania, winning the WWE Championship. Brock was given a huge push during his first WWE run. In Brock's book, Death Clutch, he talks about why he left in 2004 and why he wanted to try his luck in the NFL. He was tired of the travel, he felt beaten down. He mentioned that he wasn't thrilled about dropping the WWE Championship to Eddie Guerrero the month before WrestleMania. Brock felt like he was being replaced here, even though he understood Vince was trying to capitalize on the Latino market. And like Goldberg, Brock wasn't one to play backstage politics, at least at that time. Brock was simply fed up with the WWE. He said he was so young at the time, yet he felt like he had the body of an old man. He wanted to remain competitive, so he decided to switch over to football and say goodbye to professional wrestling. You can see the similarities with Lesnar and Goldberg though in regards to how they felt about life as a WWE superstar during this era. Now, you may think this is all leading to me saying the fans should have been more understanding at WrestleMania 20, and the fans should really appreciate how honest Goldberg and Lesnar were in terms of their departures in 2004, but that still doesn't excuse the fact that their match at WrestleMania 20 was absolutely horrible. There's really no excuse for the match turning out the way it did. Goldberg and Brock first bumped into each other at Survivor Series 2003. Brock was the WWE Champion, Goldberg was the World Champion. Brock was cutting a promo about how he could beat anyone in the world, and Goldberg interrupted him. Goldberg introduced himself as the World Heavyweight Champion, and he wanted to know if Brock was going to wish him luck in his upcoming match against Triple H. Brock didn't answer. At the Royal Rumble pay-per-view in 2004, the two would meet again. Brock was still the WWE Champion, but Goldberg had dropped the World Belt the previous month at Armageddon. This time, Brock interrupted Goldberg after Lesnar had defeated Hardcore Holly. Brock said this interview should be with the WWE Champion, and Goldberg makes Lesnar panic a little when he says Hardcore Holly's standing right behind him. Lesnar felt a little embarrassed by what happened, so he decided to bide his time and wait until the Royal Rumble match to get some revenge. Goldberg entered the match at number 30, he was cleaning house and hitting spears left, right and centre, but then Brock came down and Goldberg takes an F5. With Goldberg distracted, Kurt Angle was able to dump him over the top rope. Lesnar laughed as he headed back up the entranceway. The night after the Royal Rumble, Goldberg looked in the camera and he said it doesn't matter which show he's on, Brock Lesnar is next. The week after that, Steve Austin, the sheriff of Monday Night Raw, paid Goldberg a visit in the locker room and Austin had a gift for Bill. Austin has a friend who gave him a ticket to the No Way Out pay-per-view. The Smackdown exclusive show would be headlined by Brock Lesnar defending the WWE Championship against Eddie Guerrero, and seeing as Austin can't go to the show, he thought Goldberg might want to sit front row and watch the WWE title match. Austin told Goldberg that he's representing the good name of Stone Cold if he decides to show up, and Austin told Goldberg not to do anything he wouldn't do. The relationship between Austin and Goldberg looked good, but then on the 9th of February episode of Raw, things got a little rocky. Paul Heyman showed up to Raw to warn Goldberg about what could happen if he interferes in Brock Lesnar's match, and Goldberg decides to spear Paul in the middle of the ring. Goldberg then tried to spear Mr. McMahon. Vince was trying to tell Goldberg not to go to the No Way Out pay-per-view, but Vince moves out of the way and Austin takes the full impact of the spear. Goldberg told Austin it was a mistake afterwards, and Austin says if Goldberg ever takes a Stone Cold Stunner, Goldberg better believe that it won't be a mistake. At the No Way Out pay-per-view, an empty seat was seen in the front row and the commentators weren't sure if Goldberg would show up. After the third match, Goldberg took his seat and immediately Paul Heyman came out to warn Goldberg not to jump over the barricade. Heyman said if Goldberg thinks about getting involved at any point in the night, then Bill would get arrested and removed from the arena by force. Brock Lesnar didn't want to hear it. Brock told Goldberg to get in the ring while Paul was screaming for Bill to stay away. Goldberg ends up getting inside the ropes, the crowd pops as both men get ready to fight, and they go at it. Goldberg counters an F5 attempt and Brock ends up taking a jackhammer. Again the crowd pops, but Paul isn't going to stand for it. Security gets called down and Goldberg's brought back up the rampway in handcuffs. We thought that was it all over, but later on during the Lesnar vs Guerrero match, Goldberg appeared again, spearing Lesnar towards the end of the bout and helping Eddie Guerrero win the WWE Championship. The end of No Way Out was great. Eddie's celebration is still awesome to look back at today, but now Goldberg has to stand by his actions and you just know Lesnar's going to come after him for what he did at the pay-per-view. On the next episode of Smackdown, Brock Lesnar cut a promo and he looked pretty down and pretty defeated. He said Eddie's just going to pawn off the WWE Championship belt, whereas the belt meant everything to the next big thing. And when Brock begins addressing Goldberg, his tone completely changes. Lesnar says Goldberg's going to feel the pain and Brock's going to break Goldberg in half. Brock asks Mr. McMahon for a shot at Goldberg at WrestleMania. Brock doesn't care what Austin thinks, what Heyman thinks, what Eric Bischoff thinks. Lesnar gets on his knees and he begs for a match against Goldberg. And yeah, he begs hard. So hard that it looks like he's taking a shit in the middle of the ring, but I digress. Over on Raw, Vince McMahon says he wasn't so sure if this match should happen. There isn't a referee who could maintain such a match. That's fucking laughable in hindsight, but Steve Austin comes out and Stone Cold suggests that he referees the match at WrestleMania. Vince wonders what's in it for Stone Cold, and Austin says it's none of McMahon's business. Maybe there was going to be some sort of storyline involving Austin if Goldberg or Lesnar stuck around after WrestleMania, who knows. But Vince makes the match official, and so we have another WrestleMania match booked for Madison Square Garden. Austin then refereed a Vince McMahon vs Eric Bischoff match to show he was up for the task at hand, but Brock Lesnar made a surprise appearance and Stone Cold got F5'd. On the following episode of Smackdown, Brock said he attacked Austin because Stone Cold gave Goldberg the ticket to No Way Out. Austin was just as responsible for Brock losing the title as Bill Goldberg. Brock Lesnar would steal Steve Austin's ATV. Sheriff Austin had drove his ATV to the ring for a few months and it became part of his overall character for a little while anyway, and Lesnar decided to steal the ATV and take it to Smackdown. It's a bit of an odd storyline development. We're just 2 weeks away from Mania and Goldberg isn't really involved anymore. It's all about Austin wanting to get his ATV back. Maybe at this point Bill had confirmed he wasn't going to sign a new contract and the WWE wanted to limit his screen time, I don't know. But Goldberg was not featured on the Raw before WrestleMania and that's unusual. Stone Cold promised to get his vehicle back on the SmackDown before Mania. Paul Heyman rallied the troops. Paul did not want Steve Austin at SmackDown and Paul wanted to show Austin that he wasn't welcome. Throughout the night, Heyman tried to make sure that Austin wouldn't get anywhere near the ring, and at the very end of the show, Brock challenged Austin to come to the ring and get his ATV while the SmackDown roster lined up at each side of the entranceway. Austin appears, he begins to walk down the ramp, and the SmackDown superstars allow him to pass. The Big Show's the last guy Austin has to walk past to get to Brock and his ATV, and the Big Show lets Steve walk on by before the SmackDown guys all head to the back. Stone Cold takes his ATV, he parks it on the ramp, he and Brock then have a fight on the entranceway and Brock gets busted open after getting his head rammed into the ring post. Paul Heyman takes a stunner in the ring, and this gives Brock a chance to hit an F5, but Austin counters and Lesnar gets out of the ring before getting hit with a stunner. Brock walks past the ATV, the crowd cheers for Austin, and that's the final segment before WrestleMania later in the week. By the time WrestleMania had arrived, everyone in the arena knew that Goldberg hadn't signed a new contract, and they also found out that Brock was leaving the WWE after this match inside Madison Square Garden. The news had leaked out via the dirt sheets, and if there was ever a crowd who was going to give the guys in the ring a hard time, it would be the New York crowd. At the time, I wasn't too big into checking the news websites and all that shit, so when I watched WrestleMania 20 live, I had no idea that either man was gonna leave. So the crowd's reaction really took me by surprise and I had to get the news after the match. I also listened to what the commentators said and Jim Ross pretty much confirmed that Brock Lesnar was gone after this bout, but Ross didn't say anything about Goldberg. I also remember reading too that Goldberg was given the win on this night as a last ditch effort to get him to re-sign for another year, but I'm not sure if I believe that. If both men were leaving, then it really didn't matter who won the match, but I guess there was a higher chance of Goldberg coming back down the road, seeing as Lesnar was hell-bent on entering a completely new line of work. All three men get in the ring and the crowd's booing the competitors while cheering for the special referee. And even if both men weren't leaving, I'm sure the crowd still would have booed because the match was that bad. There's no other way to say it. They circle around the ring for what seems like an eternity, they stare at each other, they shout at each other, they take the time to stare down Steve Austin, and at one point the crowd chants for Austin. This makes Austin smile. It was an odd way to start the match, and yes, you may say they were building anticipation, but seeing as both guys were talking about ripping each other apart, and seeing as Vince McMahon added Austin as a referee because this match would be so unimaginably brutal and violent, then you can maybe see where I'm coming from here. The crowd then start chanting "You sold out" and they sing goodbye.
Stealing Austin's ATV.
When the two eventually lock up, they stay locked up for ages. Neither man gets an advantage, so they break it up, and the crowd boos again while chanting "boring." They lock up again, the exact same thing happens, only this time they stay locked up even longer. The crowd once again boos when they break the lockup, and yeah, not a good start at all. They lost the crowd before they even stepped in the ring, and they ensured they were never getting them back after the lockups. Madison Square Garden's now chanting "This match sucks." You'd think they'd call an audible and say "fuck it, let's beat the hell out of each other," but no. Brock gets thrown into the ropes from a side headlock, he tries a shoulder block and nobody moves a muscle. Goldberg tries the same and again there's no movement. The two men then go nose to nose as the boos become deafening, and they make it worse by running into each other before the two competitors crash to the mat. They then sit and look at each other across the ring, and it's at this moment where you're like, are these fuckers sabotaging the match? I mean, why do this when Madison Square Garden is giving you all the feedback you need? Something you may notice too is that Steve Austin is not wearing an earpiece. Usually a referee gets instructions from Gorilla to send to the guys inside the ring if something needs changed on the fly. I'm not saying that there wasn't someone else around the ring sending messages from the back, by the way, but it's something to take note of. Lesnar finally starts laying in the boots, and this makes the audience take a bit more notice. And then Goldberg performs his military press spinebuster. This makes the crowd cheer for just a moment, and maybe it should have started out like this. It gets a good reaction. Lesnar then dodges a spear attempt and Goldberg hits the ring post. On the outside, Goldberg gets his shoulder rammed into the opposite ring post, and there's a loud Goldberg sucks chant now inside the Garden. Back inside the ring, Lesnar hits 2 suplexes, and he then decides to lock in a neck vice. This is just what this match needs, isn't it? A good old submission hold. The crowd chants Hogan at someone in the nosebleeds. Maybe it was a fan who dressed up for the occasion.
I find that somewhat offensive, but in any event.
A hip lock takeover gets Goldberg out of trouble, and then that mad bastard Lesnar locks in another neck vice. The crowd boos, and they boo even louder when it gets broken up and Lesnar hits a clothesline on Goldberg. Lesnar does some damage in the corner, but Goldberg comes back with a few clotheslines. The crowd are cheering, but again, they aren't cheering for what's happening in the ring. It's something going on in the stands. Goldberg hits his spinning neckbreaker, he lines Brock up, and we see the spear. Goldberg covers Brock, but Brock kicks out at 2. Goldberg argues with Austin that it was a 3 count, but this leads to Lesnar hitting the F5. Goldberg kicks out, Austin and Lesnar then have an argument, but it doesn't lead to anything. Goldberg then dodges a shoulder charge in the corner and he hits the second spear of the match. He then hits the jackhammer and the crowd cheers after the 3 count, probably because it's all over and they can move on to the next match. After the bout, the crowd starts singing goodbye again and Brock flips the crowd off. He then flips Austin off and he takes a Stone Cold Stunner on his way out the door. Goldberg doesn't get off lightly either. He gets back in the ring to celebrate with Austin. The crowd boos relentlessly as Goldberg shares a few Steve Weisers with the Rattlesnake. And then the crowd goes crazy when Austin hits a stunner on Goldberg. I don't think the match was intentionally sabotaged by both guys, and I don't think they put on a dud on purpose. I do think they couldn't have cared either way though, and they just decided to go through the motions and there wasn't much motivation. They were both leaving, they were both at the end of their contracts, they both got paid, and there was no desire to steal the show. It's amazing when you look at Lesnar versus Angle at WrestleMania 19 and then you look at this right here. And Goldberg was capable of a whole lot more, as evidenced in some of his longer WCW matches. Halloween Havoc 1998 springs to mind. When Goldberg came back to the WWE to face Lesnar again, this WrestleMania match was brought up more than once. Goldberg said he wanted redemption for how he left. He was angry, he was a little bitter, he felt he left on bad terms and he wanted to come back and make it right and do it all again with Lesnar. But as mentioned earlier in the video, the redemption of Bill Goldberg may have went on a little longer than fans would have liked, and it didn't take long for WWE viewers to once again turn on Goldberg. The WrestleMania 20 match though, without a doubt, was a bad way to exit the company, and it did leave fans with a bad taste in their mouths. Imagine being excited for this one too, like I was back in 2004, and imagine thinking the triple threat main event wasn't going to be all that good. Sometimes when you watch this stuff, you gotta go in with zero expectations. That way you can never be disappointed. That'll do it for this one, guys. I'll follow this up down the road with a look at Lesnar vs Goldberg in 2016 and their second WrestleMania match at Mania 33. Thanks for watching and take care.